You think royal guards just stand there doing nothing? Think again. In the next few minutes, you're about to witness a moment that shattered every misconception about these silent sentinels and showed the world what real courage looks like. Before we dive in, tap that like button if you believe that honor, duty, and real strength still matter in today's world. Subscribe to our channel for true stories of bravery and resilience. And don't forget to ring the bell, because the next story might just restore your faith in humanity. Now, picture this. The golden afternoon sun glinted off the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the cobblestone plaza. Hundreds of visitors from all corners of the globe stood gathered, buzzing with excitement, their cameras flashing, their voices humming in dozens of different languages. At the center of it all stood Corporal Michael Rivers, a royal guard, the very embodiment of dignity and discipline. In his scarlet tunic and towering bearskin hat, he was a symbol of tradition, of sacrifice, and of quiet strength. Tourists marveled at his stillness. Children waved, elderly couples smiled with admiration. It seemed like the kind of peaceful afternoon that would pass without incident. The kind of day where history feels safe, where nothing ever goes wrong. But not far beyond the admiring crowd, something was brewing. A figure was moving with a kind of swagger and arrogance that didn't belong in a place of honor. Someone was about to test the patience of a man trained not just to endure, but to protect. And when that line was crossed, well, let's just say Corporal Rivers would show everyone, tourists, troublemakers, and skeptics alike, why silence does not mean weakness. Stay with us. You won't believe how this story ends. Among the sea of excited faces that afternoon, no one paid much attention to the man weaving through the crowd. At first, Kyle Dawson looked like any other tourist. Jeans, a scuffed jacket, a camera slung carelessly around his neck. But there was something off about him. Something in the way he moved, a swagger too aggressive for a place so steeped in reverence. While families posed for photos and children clutched ice creams, Kyle pushed his way closer to the palace gates, his heavy boots scuffing loudly against the stones. He didn't smile. He didn't admire the grandeur. Instead, he smirked. Standing before him, just a few feet away, was Corporal Michael Rivers, the royal guard who had not moved an inch. Kyle tilted his head and chuckled under his breath. "Look at this guy," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "All dressed up like a toy soldier. Bet he thinks he's better than the rest of us." A few tourists glanced nervously toward him but quickly looked away. Nobody wanted to get involved. Not here. Not now. Kyle stepped closer. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted directly at Michael, "Hey, you! You even real, man? Or just some mannequin with a heartbeat?" No response. The guard's stillness was legendary. Trained, practiced, perfected. But Kyle wasn't here for tradition. He was here for attention. He laughed again, louder this time, drawing uncomfortable stares. Then, with deliberate disrespect, he reached out and jabbed a finger sharply against the buttons on Michael's crimson jacket. The crowd gasped. One small child tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is that man being mean?" The mother shook her head and whispered, "Some people don't understand respect, honey." Corporal Rivers did not flinch. He stood stoic and unyielding, as he had been trained to do. Kyle, emboldened by the lack of reaction, grew louder. He threw his arms wide, addressing the tourists like an actor playing to an audience. "See? Nothing. He's just a guy in a funny hat who gets paid to stand there like a statue. Some hero, huh?" Murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. Phones were raised. Cameras began recording, but no one stepped in. The unwritten rule held strong: never interfere with the royal guard. And besides, no one quite knew where the line was. When did taunting turn into something dangerous? Kyle was about to answer that question. He circled Michael slowly, like a shark sizing up its prey. "You think you're special, standing there all stiff?" he sneered. "You're not. You're a joke, a tourist attraction." Kyle's eyes narrowed. The smirk faded from his face, replaced with something darker. He stepped so close that his breath stirred the feathers of the guard's tall bearskin hat. "You can't even talk back, can you?" he whispered, low and venomous. "You're nothing." He heard Michael's shoulder hard enough to rock him slightly off balance. Still the guard did not respond. Still he held the line. The tension in the plaza grew unbearable. People shifted uncomfortably. A few whispered urgently to each other, debating whether to find a security officer. But they didn't have to wait long for Kyle to escalate again. He shoved the guard's chest with both hands. This time, Corporal Rivers swayed back slightly but quickly recovered, resuming his perfect, silent stance, as if nothing had happened. Kyle threw his head back and laughed mockingly. "See, he's nothing, just a puppet." He turned to the crowd, searching for approval, but he found none. Parents held their children tighter. Older tourists shook their heads in disgust. Some brave souls called out weakly, "Leave him alone. Show some respect." Kyle ignored them. To him, the guard's silence wasn't strength, it was weakness. And he intended to exploit it. "You're pathetic," he spat. "You don't deserve that uniform." And with that, Kyle made his boldest move yet. He reached out and slapped the side of Michael's bearskin hat, knocking it askew on the guard's head. The crowd gasped audibly, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to suck all the air from the plaza. Even Kyle looked momentarily shocked by his own audacity. The palace, the tourists, the centuries of tradition, all of it desecrated in one thoughtless act of arrogance. But still, Corporal Rivers did not move. Still he endured. Still he protected the dignity of his post with a resolve that few could understand. And that only enraged Kyle further. He stepped back, his fists clenching, his voice growing louder and more hostile. "What's the matter, soldier boy?" he snarled. "You gonna cry? You gonna run to your mommy?" He pointed to the crowd, mocking. "Look at your big hero, folks, standing there like a scared little boy." The tourists remained silent. No one cheered, no one laughed. They watched horrified as the tension spiraled out of control. And it was then, through the growing storm of hatred, that another figure stepped forward. An older man, walking slowly with the help of a wooden cane. His face weathered but strong, his bearing unmistakable. Thomas Ward, retired British Army veteran. He wasn't a royal guard, he wasn't even in uniform. But he understood more about discipline, duty, and sacrifice than Kyle Dawson ever would. Thomas planted himself firmly between Kyle and the guard. His voice, though quieter than Kyle's bluster, carried more weight. "That's enough," he said, looking Kyle dead in the eyes. "You're not proving anything here, you're just embarrassing yourself." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The crowd watched, breathless. Kyle sneered. "Yeah? And who's gonna stop me, old man?" Thomas didn't blink. "Respect isn't earned by shouting," he said. "It's earned by knowing when to stand firm." Kyle's face twisted in anger, and in that instant, with the crowd holding its breath, he did the unthinkable. He raised his hand, balling it into a fist, aiming a punch directly at the veteran's face. And that's when everything changed. Just as Kyle Dawson spun on his heel, ready to humiliate the silent guard even further, a voice rose through the heavy, expectant air. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, firm, unshakable. "That's enough." The crowd turned in unison, their collective breath caught in their chests. From among the tourists, a man stepped forward. Not a young man full of bravado, but an older gentleman, his hair silvered by time, his posture proud despite the cane he leaned on. His name was Thomas Ward, a veteran, a man who had worn the uniform of his country, who had stared fear in the face and never wavered. Today, Thomas wore no medals, no polished boots or gleaming buttons, only a simple gray jacket. worn hands, and the quiet authority of someone who had lived through harder days than Kyle Dawson could ever imagine. Kyle sneered when he saw him. "Oh, great," he barked, throwing his arms up in mock exasperation. "Now we've got Grandpa stepping in. What's next, the Queen herself?" A few uneasy chuckles rippled at the edges of the crowd, but most people stood silent, sensing something important was happening. Thomas didn't flinch. He took a steady step closer, his cane tapping sharply against the stone beneath his feet. "You're making a fool of yourself," Thomas said, his voice steady as iron. "Leave the guard alone. He's doing his duty. Something you clearly know nothing about." Kyle's grin twisted into a sneer. He stepped toward Thomas, towering over the older man by at least a foot. He jabbed a finger at the veteran's chest. "And what would you know about it, old man, huh?" He spat. "You think wearing a uniform makes you special? Makes you better than me?" Thomas stood firm. His gaze never wavered. "I know exactly what it means," he said, his voice low but caring across the silent square. "It means sacrifice, discipline, courage, things you wouldn't recognize if they stood right in front of you." A few people in the crowd nodded, murmuring soft agreements. Kyle's face flushed red, part anger, part humiliation. "You think you're so tough, don't you?" he growled. "You need to learn some respect." Without warning, Kyle shoved Thomas roughly, hard enough to make the older man stumble backward. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Several people shouted. Mothers pulled their children close. Thomas caught himself gripping his cane, but the blow had shaken him. Kyle took another aggressive step forward, his fists clenching, his voice thick with mockery. "Come on, old man," he sneered. "Show me how tough you really are." Thomas straightened, drawing himself up to his full height, shorter now with age, but no less dignified. "You think violence makes you strong," he said quietly. "It doesn't. It makes you small." Kyle's face twisted with rage, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. The crowd stood paralyzed, not daring to breathe. Thomas braced himself, knowing he couldn't defend against what was coming. Kyle cocked back his arm, fist aimed squarely at the older man's face. It should have been over in an instant. But that's when something extraordinary happened. In a blur of red and black, Corporal Michael Rivers moved. Breaking his centuries-old tradition of silence and stillness, he stepped forward with swift, calculated precision. In a single fluid motion, he caught Kyle's punch mid-air, stopping it inches from Thomas's face. The crowd gasped again, but this time in awe. Kyle struggled against the iron grip clamping down on his wrist, but it was no use. It was like trying to fight a steel beam. Michael's voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, deadly serious. "That's enough." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word dripped with authority, the kind of authority that only comes from a lifetime of discipline. Michael stepped between Thomas and Kyle, shielding the older man with his own body. For a moment, Kyle tried to pull free, tried to reassert his dominance. But Michael's grip tightened, and Kyle winced audibly, his earlier swagger collapsing into a sniveling, panicked energy. "You've crossed the line," Michael said, his voice low and deliberate. "This ends now." Kyle looked around wildly, hoping for support from the crowd, but found only disapproving stares and shaking heads. Even the teenagers had put their phones down, stunned into respectful silence. In a smooth, practiced motion, Michael twisted Kyle's arm behind his back and forced him to his knees. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Kyle's shallow breathing and the whisper of the afternoon wind. And then, applause. Soft at first, then growing. Parents, veterans, tourists, young and old. They clapped not just for the action, but for what it represented: discipline, honor, true strength. Thomas placed a hand on Michael's arm, his voice trembling with emotion. "You didn't have to do that, son," he said, "but you did. and you reminded all of us what it means to serve something greater than yourself." Michael gave a small nod, his expression never wavering. Soon, two members of palace security arrived, quickly taking custody of Kyle Dawson. He struggled weakly against them, his head bowed low in shame. The royal guard released him without ceremony, stepping back into position. Within seconds, Michael adjusted his bare-skinned hat, squared his shoulders, and resumed his silent watch. To the casual tourist arriving late, it would seem as if nothing had happened at all. But for those who had witnessed it, something had changed. Because in that quiet square on that golden afternoon, they had seen what real strength looked like. And it didn't come with shouting, or fists, or rage. It came in the form of discipline, dignity, and the unwavering courage to protect what is right, no matter the cost. For a heartbeat, the entire plaza stood still. Corporal Michael Rivers held Kyle Dawson's wrist in an iron grip, his posture unshaken, his expression calm but unmovable, the very embodiment of control. Kyle struggled, yanking and twisting, but it was useless. The royal guard's head didn't even tremble. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Parents shielded young eyes, tourists clutched their phones tighter, recording every second, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Kyle sneered, trying to bluster his way out. "Let me go," he shouted. "You're not supposed to move. You're just a statue. You can't touch me." But Michael Rivers didn't so much as blink. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, his voice low, steady, and filled with authority. "My duty," he said, "is to protect the people, and that includes protecting them from people like you." With deliberate precision, Michael adjusted his stance. In one seamless motion, he twisted Kyle's arm behind his back, applying just enough pressure to force the thug to his knees, without ever raising his voice or causing unnecessary harm. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in soft, awestruck murmurs. Phones lifted higher. Whispers of, "Did you see that?" and "Incredible!" rippled through the square. Kyle grimaced, his earlier bravado crumbling into frustration and fear. "You can't do this," he spat, his voice cracking. Michael remained stoic. "I gave you every chance," he said quietly. "You chose to ignore the warnings, now you'll face the consequences." Thomas Ward, still catching his breath nearby, watched in profound admiration. This young soldier, silent, disciplined, and respectful, had acted not out of rage, but out of duty. It was a rare sight in today's world, strength without cruelty, power without arrogance. Michael kept Kyle subdued, forcing him to kneel respectfully before the crowd he had moments earlier mocked. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. Real strength, they realized, wasn't about shouting the loudest. It wasn't about throwing punches or making threats. It was about knowing when to act and acting with honor. Kyle's struggles weakened. The weight of shame settled on his shoulders. He muttered under his breath, his anger giving way to humiliation. "This isn't fair," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. Michael heard him but didn't react. Instead, he maintained his grip, his posture upright and measured. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was restoring order. He was reminding everyone, without ever raising his voice, what dignity truly looked like. The crowd, once filled with fear, now brimmed with admiration. Spontaneous applause began, growing louder with each passing second. Parents clapped, veterans in the crowd saluted quietly, tourists cheered and shouted words of respect. Thomas stepped closer, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "You didn't have to do that," he said to Michael. "But you did. You protected me, and you showed all of us what real honor still means." Michael gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He hadn't acted for applause, he hadn't acted for recognition, he had acted because it was right. At that moment, two palace security officers arrived, alerted by the disturbance. They quickly assessed the scene, their eyes widening slightly at the sight of the subdued man, and the imposing royal guard standing over him, one officer stepped forward respectfully. "We'll take it from here, sir," he said. Michael released Kyle's arm with careful precision, ensuring the man stayed balanced enough not to fall. There was no cruelty in his actions, only professionalism. The security team hauled Kyle to his feet, his head hanging low, his face burning with humiliation. The cheers from the crowd grew louder as Kyle was led away, his swagger now reduced to a broken, defeated shuffle. Michael returned to his post without a word. He adjusted his bearskin hat. He straightened his tunic, and with a soft click of his boots, he resumed his silent, stoic watch, as if nothing had happened at all. But for everyone who witnessed it, everything had changed. They had seen something rare, something beautiful. They had seen a living reminder that strength isn't in the volume of your voice. It's not in how hard you shove or how loudly you threaten. True strength is quiet. It is deliberate. It is the courage to act when necessary, and the discipline to stand still when the world demands chaos. As the crowd slowly dispersed, you could hear their reflections and passing whispers. "That's a real hero," one woman said, dabbing her eyes. "He didn't lose his temper," a man marveled. "He didn't even need to." "That's real power." Nearby, a grandfather knelt beside his grandson who had watched the entire scene with wide, awe-struck eyes. "Did you see how he protected that older man without even shouting?" the boy asked. The grandfather smiled, squeezing his shoulder. "That's because real heroes," he said, "don't need to yell. They just stand up when it matters most." Thomas Ward lingered a little longer at the edge of the plaza, watching Corporal Michael Rivers, now once again a silent sentinel. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that even in a noisy, chaotic world, dignity, honor, and courage still lived on, sometimes in the quietest places. As the sun began to dip behind the spires of Buckingham Palace, its golden rays framed the royal guard in a halo of light. Unmoving, unbreakable, unforgettable. As the last echoes of applause faded into the warm London afternoon, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace seemed to shift. There, standing once again in his post, was Corporal Michael Rivers, the very image of calm, dignity, and unwavering strength. To any passerby who hadn't witnessed a confrontation, it would have seemed as if nothing unusual had happened. But for those who had stood in that crowd, who had seen a silent sentinel rise in defense of honor and decency, things would never quite look the same again. Thomas Ward, the elderly veteran Michael had protected, lingered for a moment. He didn't say much, just a firm handshake, a quiet thank you, and a look of deep respect that said everything words could not. Michael, ever composed, offered only a small, respectful nod before returning his gaze forward, back into the timeless duties of his post. But for everyone there, it was a reminder, a moment carved into memory, of what real heroism looks like, and what it doesn't. Because true strength isn't about domination or loud words. It isn't about being bigger, faster, or stronger. True strength lies in restraint, discipline, and choosing to act only when it matters most. It's about using your power, whatever power you have, not to tear others down, but to lift up those who cannot stand alone. Today, in a world that sometimes feels louder, harsher, and more divided than ever before, this story offers a powerful lesson for all of us, young and old. Especially for those of us who have lived long enough to know that life's greatest battles aren't fought with fists, they're fought with character. We all face Kyles in life, people who test our patience, insult our values, or try to provoke us into losing our temper. But just like Corporal Withers, we are called to remember, real strength is quiet, real dignity is patient, real courage is calm. Whether you're standing up for a friend, defending your beliefs, or simply choosing to respond to anger with grace, You have the power to be a protector, not a destroyer. You don't need a uniform or a tall bearskin hat. You don't need medals or applause. You just need the willingness to stand steady in the face of wrong and to act with honor when the moment demands it. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the kind of values we must never let fade, we'd love to hear from you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate Corporal Rivers' actions today? Leave your rating and thoughts down in the comments below. We read every one and love hearing your perspectives. If you believe the world needs more reminders of dignity, courage, and honor, please do us a favor, hit the like button. It helps others discover inspiring stories just like this one. Subscribe to our channel. We post real stories of resilience, honor, and hope every week. Tap the bell so you never miss a moment that might just restore your faith in humanity. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And your example, just like Corporal Rivers's, can make a difference no matter where you stand in the world. The sun dipped lower behind Buckingham Palace, casting long golden shadows across the plaza. Tourists slowly drifted away, many pausing for one last glance at the silent figure standing guard. But they didn't see just a uniform anymore. They saw a man who had proven, without shouting, without boasting, that true strength lives in the heart. As Thomas Ward disappeared into the bustling streets of London, walking just a little taller, stepping just a little lighter, a simple truth lingered in the air. Heroes are not always loud. Sometimes they are simply the ones who stand silently between darkness and light. And sometimes the greatest acts of courage are done without saying a single word,